Well, folks, thank y'all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank y'all for having me. And it's a pleasure to come talk to y'all. I mean, the Hoods Tennessee campaign has been a favorite of mine. And of course, numerous books have been written about Spring Hill and Franklin and small degree Nashville, but there's not a lot that actually deals with the whole campaign. And I'm looking at trying to do something about everything when the Army's moving through North Georgia, through here, through North Alabama, crossing the river, and looking at, Gibson's brigade's involvement in that as well. Now, the Gibson's brigade is Louisiana brigade. It's an all-Louisiana brigade in the Army of Tennessee. It's a very colorful bunch, to say the least. The unit had been together since the Battle of Shiloh, where they were literally brought up from New Orleans to Corinth, and then went into service there. And they'll fight at the Battle of Shiloh, part of the troops that assault the Hornets' Nest there. But then they're stuck with the Army of Tennessee for the rest of their existence. But most of their time, first few years of the war, though, they're not Gibson's brigade just yet. They're General Daniel Adams's brigade. And they'll be with Adams at Perryville, Murfreesboro, and Chickamauga, where Adams is wounded. Adams was a big guy, a little too big, because when he's wounded, his brigade's driven back at Chickamauga, and he's captured by a group of men. Oh, wow, we caught a Confederate general. They start taking him to the rear on a litter. Go back a few yards. Nah, it ain't worth it. Let him down. Along come a bunch of other Union troops. Hey, it's a Confederate general. They capture him. They take him, start taking him to the rear. Go back a few yards. He's pretty heavy. They set him back down. This happens about 6 times before he's finally taken to the rear. And of course, though, with the wound he is ultimately exchanged, but the wound disabled him. And so command will now go to the senior colonel in the brigade, which was Colonel Randall Gibson of the 13th Louisiana. Now, 13th is in a colorful brigade. The 13th is probably the most colorful bunch. The whole regiment is out of New Orleans. And it reflects New Orleans very well. It's mostly made up of Irish, about half the regiment's Irish immigrants. The other half the regiment is German immigrants. Half the regiment had been before the war the Avingo Zouaves. So at Shiloh, they're wearing those baggy red pants and the fancy jackets and red kepis and everything. While the other half, part of the other regiment was the Governor's Guards, which is another pre-war militia, but all blue. So, in these early war battles, how some Confederates wore blue, some Yankees wore gray. That's kind of how it, plays out a little bit there with them. But anyway, they end up with this just reputation, especially the 13th, with all the Irish. They got in a lot of trouble, needless to say, especially when alcohol was available. Not to play up a stereotype, but they played up a stereotype. But the other colorful thing is, since you got a bunch of German immigrants, some of which can barely speak English, and of course the Irish, who very thickly accented English. So how do you effectively command these men? In French. Because that's oddly enough, that was the one language that both groups did know. Of course, the Irish, many times always not really caring so much for the English, but siding sometimes with the French in conflicts when the English and the French were fighting. And they're also Catholics, so they've got a Catholic chaplain and everything for the regiment as well. And of course, Gibson, though, who commands them, is not either one of these ethnic groups, but he's a blue blood. He's the son of a very wealthy sugarcane planter from the Thibodaux parish. And a little bit about Gibson himself. I got it. This is him. Randall Gibson, in many ways, I think, is the personification of what a Confederate officer should look like. Looking at that picture, the goatee and just the ramrod straight, posture, and a waist that's probably about 12 inches around in the photograph. But Gibson was born actually in Kentucky while his parents were visiting his grandfather, who had a plantation there, and he was born in September of 1832. So puts him his the early 30s when it comes about. But he's very typical of the upper class Southerners in the high-ranking officer corps. He was tutored when he bound to Terrebonne Parish, where his family lived, and he went on to graduate from Yale, and then gets a law degree through the University of Louisiana. And so he's a lawyer and a planter before the Civil War. And but he also spent several years abroad studying too before he set up shop as a lawyer. And actually goes to school in Germany, in the Germanic states. But most interestingly is that he is also appointed as a ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Madrid, Spain, before the Civil War. So in this all the time he's in his late 20s. So speaks pretty highly of the young man, to get such an important appointment when he's just in his 20s. But he will be one of the leading officers. He gets an appointment to the state of Louisiana, the governor's staff during the secession crisis, and then translates that to getting the colonelcy of the 13th Louisiana. So it'll be the regiment he will ultimately, command, and then go on to now get command of what had been Daniel Adams's brigade. Oddly enough, it's interesting, is that he will command the brigade at Missionary Ridge, but just as a colonel, because his father had clashed with a neighbor before the war, and that neighbor was Braxton Bragg. So Bragg dislikes him due to the conflict he had with his father. So it's not until Bragg is gone that Gibson gets promoted to general. He will get command at Dalton, be promoted at Dalton, Georgia, to brigadier general as the Army winters there after the disaster at Missionary Ridge. And he will then, really cut his teeth then for the first time as the Atlanta campaign begins. But now, going back to his brigade, I'm talking about how colorful they were and everything else. Well, I want to read to you a quote that described them, emphasizing how colorful they are. This is what they say about the brigade. They are Frenchmen, Spaniards, Mexicans, Dagos, Germans, Chinese, Irishmen, in fact, persons of every clime known to the geographies and travelers of the day. So again, pretty wide spectrum there, but also a little more colorful, in that Randall Gibson, by the definition of the antebellum time frame, is not white. His great-grandfather was a free African man who had been a slave owner in South Carolina in the colonial period. And of course, this was something that kind of haunted Gibson in a way, in that he really didn't want this to get out. But of course, though, it's Louisiana. You've got, PGT Beauregard. You've got several other Louisiana Confederate officers who have that type of mixed race heritage. But again, it adds a little more color to the story of the whole brigade when this is known about Gibson himself. But they will, spend the winter at Dalton. The Army's re-enlisting. All the regiments and pretty much universally all the men in the brigade re-enlist for the war at that point. again, and morale really soars while they're at Dalton. There's a big revival that goes on. And so when the men move into the field in early May of 1864, little do they know that the face of the war is going to change in the next few weeks, as the warfare, between Joseph E. Johnston and William T. Sherman goes from normal battlefield fights to trench warfare, and also almost constant warfare. Most of the time, an army would engage, fight a battle, and then it would be months before they would have another fight. But in the Atlanta campaign, it's constant, every day. And it's also constant everyday bleeding, as sharpshooters, or what they would refer to as snipers, start affecting, and young up-and-coming officers are constantly being taken out of action. And it also just whittles away at the manpower of the commands as well. And that will be reflected in Gibson's brigade, who are going to start out with 917 men. But by the end of the Atlanta campaign, they're going to be down to 549, so almost 50% losses. Although most of the combat losses will occur in only 3 battles, because the brigade kind of had a bit of good luck, it seemed. They missed most of the first big battles, but then they get thrown into a few meat grinders. Now, while mentioning Gibson's brigade, we're going to go up the chain a little bit and talk about that for a moment. During the campaign for Atlanta, they're going to be in John Bell Hood's corps of the Army of Tennessee, in Henry Dallamar Clayton's division. Clayton, Eufaula, Alabama lawyer, who goes in the military service, and then of course Gibson being the brigade commander. But you'll hear a little more about Clayton, and of course a good bit more about Hood as we move on with this. So again, the campaign is going to begin in early May of 1864, when Sherman begins moving against Joe Johnston's defenses at and around Dalton. Gibson's brigade will actually be positioned on Rocky Face Ridge, a very strong position, and there'll be some skirmishing they will be involved in. But Sherman realizes this is too strong of a position to attack head on. So he's going to start what's going to become a theme for him in the Atlanta campaign. He's going to demonstrate, keep Johnston's attention, and flank it. And most notable flanking maneuver will be through Snake Creek Gap here. James McPherson's Army of the Tennessee will slip around and kind of try to get into Johnston's rear. But McPherson, although a favorite of Grant's and Sherman's, just did not have really that strong of a killer instinct. And he Sherman will remark to him, because when he kind of gets to Resaca, he doesn't have quite enough men to barrel in there, and he kind of blanches and backs up. And Sherman will later say, "Mac, you lost the opportunity of a lifetime." But then Gibson's brigade will then be with Johnston's forces when they retreat down to Resaca. Johnston will take up a strong defensive position there, and this will ultimately be the largest battle of the Atlanta campaign. Not the bloodiest, but it's the only battle in which almost all of Sherman's forces are on the field, and almost all of Johnston's forces are on the field. The rest of the battles will only involve portions of the armies. But at Resaca, Sherman will make several assaults against heavily fortified position. That's where I was saying the face of warfare is changing. And there's some funny stories. Some of the Confederates at first balked at the idea of digging in. But after being under heavy fire from Union artillery for a few hours, they started digging. One story goes is that they dug down, the trench was about knee deep. By the end of the day, it was over their heads, because they learned it. And today, if you visit the Resaca battlefield, which is maintained by the state of Georgia, you can see the trenches there, and they are fairly impressive. But then when you get to see them at Kennesaw Mountain, where they will fight at the end of June, it's night and day. You can just see how they learned from Resaca to that point. And Gibson's men are involved in this learning, although they are going to be in reserve at Resaca and not really having to play a big role in it. But when, again, Sherman tries to break the lines, he can't. So what does he do? He flanks the position again. And Johnston has to withdraw again. Gibson's brigade will be the rear guard of the Army as they pull back down toward Cartersville, Georgia, ultimately down toward the Allatoona Mountains, and where Johnston takes up yet another strong defensive position. And what does Sherman do? He flanks it again. But this time, Johnston was a little bit ahead of him. He will rush his forces out to the crossroads near the little church named New Hope. And you're going to have a series of bloody battles there in late May in some of the most inhospitable terrain and conditions you could ever imagine. Pine thickets and what the men will nickname the Hell Hole. And I can tell you in late May when these battles fought, there's more than one reason why it's called the Hell Hole. It was literally hell on earth in the fighting, but that area is literally a hole. The ground, all the surrounding terrain, it kind of dips down into like a bowl. So that means there's no wind circulation. There's several streams. The humidity is always just brutal. The heat and everything else. So that plays into it. Besides the three bloody battles they'll have there. But the first of these battles will be the namesake battle, the Battle of New Hope Church, and Gibson's brigade will be involved in this. Specifically, Gibson has a sharpshooter battalion, Austin Sharpshooter Battalion. And they'll actually play a role here at Florence, the crossing the river at Florence. And one casualty of this assault, Andrew Devilby, is a member of that battalion, so he would have been involved in the fighting there. But it's fought in just thick, tangled woods in their front as Sherman's men try to assault the area and are just going to be driven back with heavy losses. But Gibson is still, his brigade, remember, 917 men, probably dwindled down a little bit due to sharpshooters and sickness and everything else by the time they get here. But he's going to report losing 128 men at New Hope Church. And most of them being in Austin's battalion and one other of the Louisiana regiments who were out in the open initially as the skirmishers as the attack began. But then after Sherman will fight a couple of more battles, he'll try to turn one flank in what becomes the Battle of Pickett's Mill, where it will be beaten back. Then they have the battle on the opposite side at Dallas, Georgia, where he tries to do the same thing again. And then finally he swings around, further around, and flanks the position again. And Johnston now has to fall back again, this time to a strong range of hills and a mountain called Kennesaw. And there they will take up a strong defensive position. And Gibson's brigade will once again find itself in reserve during most of the heavy fighting. So they kind of have a little bit of good luck. They're missing the battle at Kennesaw. They've missed Resaca because they were in reserve. But Kennesaw will tie Sherman up for about a month until finally he gets frustrated and he orders an all-out frontal assault, and it's a huge disaster. A place that's now called Cheatham Hill. In fact, afterwards, the Army of the Cumberland's commander, George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, will remark to Sherman after it, kind of a good needle to the boss, one or two more assaults like this will use up the entire army. And so, and he's right. Sherman backs off after that and again will ultimately flank the position, which will now force Johnston to ultimately cross the Chattahoochee River. And at this point, Jefferson Davis is tired of seeing the army retreat. And he has a confrontation with Johnston, demanding to know what he plans to do to stop Sherman. When Johnston evades the question and doesn't give him a clear answer, Davis relieves him of command and places the young youngest Corps commander in the Army, 32-year-old John Bell Hood in command. Hood had lost his leg at Chickamauga. His arm had also suffered a wound at Gettysburg and had nerve damage. And although he did get some use of it back, he never fully recovered the use of the arm. So at 32, he's pretty chewed up by the war already. But he now gets command of the Army because he will provide Johnston, or Davis believes, what he wants, which is action, offensive action, and which Johnston was not doing in what Davis had wanted. So what's going to happen then is that within a day's time, or a couple of days' time, Hood launches his first offensive. As Sherman's starting to cross the Chattahoochee River, Hood will move forward to attack elements of Sherman's men as they're crossing the river at a place called Peachtree Creek. And it turns into a kind of a boondoggle of a battle. Things are going to be mismanaged across the board. And Gibson's brigade is supposed to be ordered into the fight, but guess what? Again, the orders called off. And the men were quite thankful of it. Several of them noted that hearing all the gunfire going on, they were thankful that they missed out on this. So anyway, the Army will now fall. At the same time, Sherman was swinging a force around to the east of Atlanta to try to cut the rail lines coming in from Augusta, Georgia. Hood will throw the Army out to stop them, and then on July 22nd, you'll have the Battle of Atlanta. But Gibson's brigade, again, is ordered in as support for an attack that ultimately is called off. So they miss out again. But within just 6 days, that luck is going to change. Hood now finds out that Union Corps Commander Oliver O. Howard has been sent around to the west side of the city to try to cut the supply lines supply route coming into the city. And so Hood, when he was elevated to command, had to get a replacement brought in. Temporary replacement was initially General Frank Cheatham of Tennessee, but they bring in his permanent replacement, 30-year-old Stephen Dill Lee, S.D. Lee. Lee, West Pointer, had been an artillerist in Lee's army earlier in the war, very highly thought of as an artillerist, but he's now coming in as Corps Command, and for the very first time, he's now also the youngest Corps Commander in the Army. Hood had been the youngest at 32. Well, Lee is even younger than that. And but Hood will give him the assignment to take his corps out and stop Howard, but specifically tells Lee that if you find the enemy entrenched, don't attack them. Having learned what happened in the Battle of Atlanta at Peachtree Creek, Hood gives Lee these orders. Well, Lee moves out. Howard's forces are moving down at the crossroad at Ezra Church. They have begun fortifying. Lee comes upon them, finds them having entrenched, and despite his orders, he attacks anyway. Again, very rough terrain. He tries to swing in on the flank to try to hit as you can tell, the front of the army was this direction, so Lee tries to flank them, but they've refused their flank. Howard, having learned from what had happened to him at Chancellorsville, learned the value of watching your flank. And so he actually had the flank entrenched. But then everything just kind of turns into just a huge boondoggle. There's lack of coordination. The attacks don't go in as they're supposed to. In fact, Gibson had rode back to confer with Clayton when a staff officer came along from Lee and gave orders to the brigade to go ahead and attack. So Gibson's not even with them. Their own commander's not even there. And they just go in, and it just just turns into just a huge mess. And there'll be just some pretty atrocious fighting, men charging up slope in toward these fortified positions. And one of the men will later just write several descriptions of this. Okay, yeah, through the heavy undergrowth, they wisely reserved their fire until we were close to their line. So the Union troops are just waiting for them to come out of the undergrowth, and they've kind of cleared little fields of fire. The 30th Louisiana, noted when they poured such a terrific and destructive fire at short range into our line that our men were actually mowed down in windrows. But we advanced to within 20 to 25 paces of their line. Newly and large augmented columns of the enemy came pouring in upon us with the same results. However, as before, although their colors were planted within 20 paces, this is a Union soldier's account, their front lines were broken up by our deadly musketry, and their columns staggered and halted. So it's just these frontal assaults charging into these earthworks, and adding to it even some of John Logan's 15th Corps commands. Some of his troops have Henry and Spencer repeating rifles. So that just really inflicts heavy casualties on Gibson's men. 14 line officers out of 20 present fell, and were killed or wounded. The color bearer and all the color guard were shot down in the 30th Louisiana. Only 6 members of the color guard and only 3 members of the company on the left of the colors were uninjured. All of the officers of these 2 companies were either killed or wounded. Another soldier noted, we that were in the ranks could see nothing except the blazing gunfire. Within just 80 yards, a terrific fire was opened upon us that no mortal could stand. So just really horrible fighting, heavy casualties, and ultimately Gibson is going to lose 480 men in this one engagement. So almost 50% of the brigade's strength will be lost in the Battle of Ezra Church. And of course, needless to say, that's going to be reflected in all the other commands that are charging in as well. And Lee is repulsed. And Sherman once again cuts another rail line running into Atlanta, which now at this point really puts the Confederates in a bind. They now have one rail line coming in from the south to supply the city. And Sherman, over the next few weeks, will maneuver, lay siege, bombard Atlanta, but ultimately be planning to finally swing around and take out that last rail line, which he will move to do in the last part of August, so about a month after the Ezra Church. And during that time, Gibson's brigade are occupying the trenches around Atlanta, having to deal with the sweltering hot sun, sharpshooters, artillery bombardments, which also is whittling away at the manpower. But then at the end of August, Sherman will make his move, and that will lead to the Battle of Jonesboro. Hood will send 2 of his corps south to confront this attack, and the Union forces are moving toward the railroad. They take up a strong defensive position on the line of hills, and they entrench. And to drive them back from the rail line, which you can see here, the Confederate William J. Hardee, in command of S.D. Lee's corps and his corps, orders an all-out assault. And again, it will turn into predictably, heavy losses for those men involved. And in this battle, 172 more men of Gibson's brigade are lost, which now pushes his casualties well over 50% of what the brigade had been. They will end the Atlanta campaign with 549 men, which would include some of the wounded in the earlier battles that were returned to action. Think about this, though. At the beginning of the war, most of these Louisiana regiments had numbered between 800 and 1,000 men. And now the whole brigade is 549. It's just staggering to think about the losses that they will have suffered, particularly at Ezra Church. But of course, though, they're not able to protect that rail line. Sherman moves in and takes Atlanta. Hood has to abandon the city, and he'll fall back to Lovejoy Station south of Atlanta and ultimately end up at the little railroad town of Palmetto to the southwest of the city, where the Army will recoup throughout the month of September. Get visited by Jefferson Davis, who comes in to inspect the Army, which we'll tell you also is never a good sign. Every time Davis showed up to visit the Army, something bad followed. And in this case, it's going to be pretty much the same thing, because he's going to heavily hint to Hood that Hood ought to go on the offensive, to move north into Georgia, maybe swing around behind Sherman, somehow force Sherman to abandon Atlanta. And that's what Hood moves to do. He moves to try to swing into the rear to attack the rail line coming down from Chattanooga, Sherman's main supply line, to try to get Sherman to come out of Atlanta now and fighting somewhere in North Georgia. And it becomes a cat and mouse game. That's what's going to happen. And a series of nasty, severe little engagements will happen when various garrisons that are protecting the railroad are going to be struck by Hood's army. But something also is happening. As Hood's army crosses over the river on September 29th, Gibson's brigade noting they cross the river with their bands playing and bonfires lighting the side of the road as it was done in the evening, there starts to be a change that starts affecting the army. And it'll be a change that will reflect the desperation that the army now faces. They've lost Atlanta. Things are not going well in Virginia. Lee's pinned down at Petersburg. And there's a presidential election a little over a month away. And they know if Lincoln wins that election, that the war is not going to end anytime soon. But as they move north, that means they're also going to start moving through the areas they had fought over months earlier. And Gibson's brigade is at one point going to go back through that crossroads at New Hope Church. And they're going to see those battle-scarred trees, but also all the shallow graves, which their comrades they had lost earlier, were buried at. So just to give you a little bit of this, one of the soldiers noted, I think it was here that we bivouacked for a day or more within a mile of the old battleground of the previous May. I do not recall whose comrades were engaged if I heard it, nor did I see the earthworks. Neither did I see indication of the artillery fire, and the absence of carcasses of dead horses led me to believe that it was an infantry engagement. The Confederates had occupied an old field. The Federal dead had been collected and buried or carried off. And from what we saw, we inferred that the Confederates had remained there where they fell until they became offensive. Then very shallow holes were dug, some of the bodies and some of the corpses just put into them, then hid with earth. And the earth was shoveled in others just as they had lay on the field. So basically, they're just finding these graves, just really the men had not been properly buried at all. Again, we could see, noted here, we could see a hand and probably a part of an arm or a foot and maybe a part of a leg. Again, we could see one or more knees exposed, and that some mounds, dogs, or other scavengers had scratched out a greasy haversack from beneath the earth, it remaining attached around the man's neck by the strap. A detail from the were soon sent to shovel more dirt on the exposed ones. So again, what does that do to these men? To see this is what's happened to their brothers in arms. What does that start doing in their heads? Well, other things that's going to start affecting them too as they move forward, they'll notice the fields of waving corn and wheat that should perish for want, that would perish for want of men to cut them down. These fields were said to exist all along the route. I see them, just wasted food that we could all use. It is such a lovely land, but it is going untilled. So again, now farm fields that are just, the Army's never really getting enough food, and here's food, but there's no one there to take it. And then they're also just seeing abandoned homes and everything else. And so this kind of, affects the men. And at about this time, with this start happening, Hood, knowing that he's not necessarily the most popular guy with a lot of the Army, turns to one of the most popular men. One of his division commanders, Major General Patrick Claiborne. And he has Claiborne visit commands to present speeches to try to emphasize how important what they're doing is. And near Powder Springs, Georgia, Claiborne will speak to a group of soldiers. And most likely some of the Louisianans would have heard this or gotten one of his later speeches. Explaining to us the purpose of the rear move, the forced march, the result. If it succeeded, the consequences if it failed. He urged every man to do his whole duty, to stand firm by the righteous cause that they had espoused. He pictured to us Ireland in its downfallen and trampled condition, and told us if we failed, our condition would be much worse than that of Ireland's, as long as the spirit of hate and revenge lived in the North. In closing his address that night, he turned his face towards the skies, and with the fervency of his soul, he exclaimed, "If this cause that is so dear to my heart is doomed to fail, I pray heaven may let me fall with it, while my face is toward the enemy and my arm battling for which I know to be right." It was one of the most stirring patriotic speeches I ever listened to. It's also very kind of prophetic. But again, it's kind of expressing the desperation. If a major general is starting to feel this, you can definitely guess a lot of the men are too. But anyway, what's going to happen is you're going to have the Army just kind of have a little bit of a dance around North Georgia. They will move from that toward Rome. The Army will revisit Resaca. They'll demand to surrender the Union garrison there, but in the time since the battle and them coming up to it on October 12th, Resaca had become a heavily fortified little town. And when S.D. Lee kind of skirmishes a little bit with the garrison there as the bulk of the Army swung around toward Dalton, there's no real pitched battle. He decides it's just exactly too strong, and they will withdraw back. This time, the Confederates, S.D. Lee and his men, moving through Snake Creek Gap. Gibson's brigade will skirmish a little bit in this before the Army then makes a turn to the south. At this point, Sherman, who had been pursuing Hood, says, "This is a waste of my time," and made something along the comment at some point, if Hood keeps, he's been pushing Grant and Lincoln to let him go on his march to the sea, but they've kind of been putting it off, telling him, no, you have to worry about Hood. Well, Sherman will detach George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga again, and send him to Nashville with 2 corps to protect the town and to deal with Hood. And he takes the rest of the Army, turns south, and heads back to Atlanta, and then ultimately after burning what's left of Atlanta, move on towards Savannah. And so it's going to be one of the odd points in history where you have 2 armies that have been facing each other and fighting for so long, turning their backs on one another and going in opposite directions. Hood is going to move through Alabama ultimately to try to go into Tennessee to retake Nashville, while Sherman is moving to Savannah.